The dust from the overturned wagon had barely settled when Gwen Nelson realized two things simultaneously. Her water had just broken, and she was completely alone on a desolate stretch of trail, 15 miles outside Seattle, Washington. It was August 1883, and the scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky path that wound through the pine-covered hills. Gwen had been making the journey back to town after visiting her sister's homestead, confident she still had 3 weeks before her baby arrived. Her husband had died 6 months earlier in a logging accident, leaving her to face motherhood alone. Now, as pain ripped through her abdomen with frightening intensity, she clutched the side of the wagon and felt terror grip her heart. The mule that had been pulling her wagon had spooked at a rattlesnake and bolted, tipping the whole contraption sideways into a ditch. The animal was long gone, disappeared into the wilderness with its reins trailing behind it. Gwen managed to pull herself upright, her cotton dress already soaked through with sweat and amniotic fluid. At 23 years old, she had imagined her first childbirth very differently. There was supposed to be a doctor, her sister holding her hand, clean sheets and boiled water. Instead, she had rocks, dust, and the growing certainty that she might die out here with her baby. Another contraction seized her, so powerful that her knees buckled. She cried out, the sound echoing across the empty landscape. When the pain finally subsided, she gasped for breath and tried to think clearly. She needed to get somewhere sheltered, somewhere out of the sun. About 20 yards off the trail, she spotted a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural alcove. It was not much, but it would have to do. Gwen half walked, half crawled toward the rocks, stopping twice more as contractions racked her body. By the time she reached the small shaded area, her arms were scraped and bleeding, her dress torn. She collapsed against the cool stone and tried not to panic. The contractions were coming fast, much faster than she had expected. Something was wrong. This was not how childbirth was supposed to progress. She had no water, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on her back and a small knife she kept in her boot. As another wave of pain crashed over her, Gwen prayed harder than she ever had in her life. She prayed for a miracle, for someone to find her, for her baby to survive even if she did not. Miles away, Dawson Anderson was tracking a wounded elk through the same pine hills. At 26, he had spent the better part of his life working cattle ranches and learning to survive in the wilderness. He had come to Washington Territory 2 years earlier, drawn by the promise of work in the booming timber industry. But after a winter working in the logging camps, he had returned to what he knew best: horses, cattle, and the open range. He was lean and weathered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water. The elk had been injured by another hunter's careless shot, and Dawson hated the idea of the animal suffering. He had been following its blood trail for over an hour, his horse picking its way carefully through the rocky terrain. When he came around a bend in the trail and saw the overturned wagon, he immediately pulled his horse to a stop. Dawson dismounted slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Overturned wagons could mean trouble. Bandits sometimes used them as bait. But as he approached, he saw no signs of violence beyond the obvious accident. The wagon was empty, its contents scattered across the ground. What caught his attention was the set of tracks leading away from the scene, small bootprints that dragged and stumbled toward the rocks. Then he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. A woman's scream, raw and desperate. Dawson ran. He covered the 20 yards in seconds, rounding the boulder cluster to find a sight that stopped him in his tracks. A young woman lay propped against the rocks, her face contorted in agony, her dress hiked up around her thighs. Even in his shock, Dawson understood immediately what was happening. "Madam," he said, trying to keep his voice calm as he quickly moved to her side. "Madam, I'm here to help." Gwen's eyes flew open, wild with pain and fear. "The baby," she gasped. "Too early. Something's wrong." Dawson knelt beside her, his mind racing. He had helped birth countless calves and foals, had even assisted when a rancher's wife went into labor during a cattle drive 3 years back. But this was different. This woman was in serious trouble, and they were miles from any real help. "My name is Dawson Anderson," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "I've helped with births before. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or your baby. Do you understand me?" Gwen wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, a complete stranger promising to save her life in the middle of nowhere. But something in his steady gaze made her believe him. She nodded, unable to speak as another contraction began. Dawson worked quickly. He pulled off his vest and laid it on the ground, then helped Gwen move into a better position. He retrieved his canteen from his horse and made her drink, though she could barely swallow between contractions. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, and he knew they were running out of time. "What's your name?" he asked, partly to assess her alertness and partly because he needed to connect with her to keep her fighting. "Gwen," she panted. "Gwen Nelson." "Gwen, I need to see how far along you are. Is that all right?" She nodded, past the point of modesty. Dawson examined her quickly and felt his stomach drop. The baby was coming now, ready or not, but something was wrong with its position. He could feel it immediately. "The baby is breech," he said quietly. "That's why the labor is so hard, but I can help turn it. I've done it with animals. I can do it with your baby too." "Please," Gwen sobbed. "Please save my baby." "I'm going to save both of you," Dawson said firmly. What followed were the longest, most terrifying hours of both their lives. Dawson worked with careful, steady hands, doing something he had only attempted a handful of times with livestock. He had to reach inside and try to turn the baby, to give it a chance to be born safely. Gwen screamed until her voice went hoarse, but she never once told him to stop. She understood, as he did, that this was their only chance. The sun had set completely by the time Dawson finally felt the baby shift into the right position. "That's it," he breathed. "Gwen, the baby's turned. On the next contraction, you need to push with everything you have." Gwen was exhausted, delirious with pain and fear, but she heard him. When the next contraction came, she pushed, and pushed, and pushed again. Dawson supported the baby's head as it emerged, then carefully helped deliver the tiny shoulders. A moment later, a baby's cry pierced the night air. "It's a boy," Dawson said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a son." He used his knife to cut the cord, tying it off with a leather strip from his vest. Then he wrapped the baby in his shirt and placed him in Gwen's arms. In the moonlight, he could see tears streaming down her face. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's really alive." "You're both alive," Dawson corrected gently, "but we're not out of danger yet." Gwen was still bleeding, more than she should be. Dawson knew enough to understand that the afterbirth needed to come out, and quickly. He helped her through it, then did his best to clean and care for her with the limited supplies they had. He built a fire to keep them warm and to boil water from a nearby creek. He fashioned bandages from his extra clothes and made sure both mother and baby stayed as comfortable as possible. Through the long night, Dawson kept watch. He monitored Gwen for signs of fever or excessive bleeding. He made sure the baby nursed successfully. He kept the fire burning and the predators away. And slowly, as the hours passed, he began to believe they might actually make it. Dawn broke clear and beautiful over the Washington hills. Gwen woke to find herself covered with Dawson's coat, her baby sleeping peacefully against her chest. Dawson sat a few feet away, feeding the fire. When he saw her eyes open, he smiled. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Alive," Gwen said softly. "Thanks to you." Dawson shook his head. "You're the one who did all the hard work. I just helped." "You saved our lives," Gwen insisted. "Both of us would be dead if you had not found us." There was a moment of silence as they looked at each other across the fire. Something had shifted between them during the night, a bond forged in blood and fear and desperate hope. Dawson felt it as clearly as his own heartbeat, this connection to a woman he had just met, but had already seen at her most vulnerable. "What about your husband?" Dawson asked carefully. "Will he be looking for you?" Gwen's face clouded. "My husband died 6 months ago. Logging accident up in the mountains. It's just me and the baby now." "I'm sorry," Dawson said, and meant it. "What about you?" Gwen asked. "Is there someone waiting for you?" "No," Dawson admitted. "I've been on my own for a long time. Grew up on a ranch in Montana, moved around a lot after my parents died. Never really stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots." They talked through the morning as Gwen regained her strength. Dawson went to retrieve her overturned wagon and managed to right it, though one wheel was badly damaged. He caught her runaway mule grazing contentedly a mile down the trail. By early afternoon, he had fashioned a makeshift repair that would get them back to Seattle. The journey back was slow and careful. Dawson insisted on walking beside the wagon to steady it, leading his own horse behind. Gwen held her baby close, still marveling that they were both alive. She found herself watching Dawson as he navigated the rough trail, noting the careful way he moved, the competence in every action. This was a man who knew how to survive, how to do what needed doing without complaint. They reached Seattle just before sunset. The small town was bustling with activity, loggers and merchants and families going about their business. Dawson helped Gwen down from the wagon, and she directed him to her small house on the edge of town, a modest cabin that her husband had built 3 years earlier. "I don't know how to thank you," Gwen said as Dawson helped her inside. "You don't need to thank me," Dawson replied. "I'm just glad I found you when I did." But he did not leave. He stayed to help Gwen get settled, to make sure she had everything she needed. He fetched water from the well, built up her fire, and even brought food from the general store. As evening fell, Gwen finally had to insist he go rest. "You've been awake for 2 days straight," she pointed out. "You need sleep as much as I do. Will you be all right?" Dawson asked, reluctant to leave. "I'll be fine," Gwen assured him. "But will you come back tomorrow? I would like to see you again." Dawson felt something warm unfurl in his chest. "I'll be here first thing in the morning." He kept that promise. When dawn broke, Dawson was at Gwen's door with fresh milk and eggs from a nearby farm. He found her awake, nursing the baby with a peaceful expression on her face. "You need to name him," Dawson said, watching the tiny infant with something like wonder. Gwen looked down at her son, then back at Dawson. "I was thinking I would name him after you, Dawson, if that's all right with you." Dawson felt his throat tighten. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Gwen said firmly. "Every time I say his name, I'll remember the man who saved both our lives." Over the following weeks, Dawson became a fixture in Gwen's life. He came by every morning and evening, helping with whatever needed doing. He repaired her wagon properly, fixed her sagging fence, and chopped enough wood to last through the winter. He was gentle with baby Dawson, holding him with surprising ease for a cowboy who claimed he was better with horses than people. Gwen found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that surprised her. After 6 months of grief and loneliness following her husband's death, she had not expected to feel anything for anyone. But Dawson was different. He made her laugh with his dry observations about town life. He listened when she talked about her fears and hopes for her son's future. He never pushed, never demanded anything from her, but his presence was steady and comforting. For Dawson, falling in love with Gwen was as natural as breathing. He loved the way she sang softly to her baby in the evenings. He loved her strength, the way she faced each challenge without complaint. He loved the sound of her laugh, rare at first but growing more frequent as the weeks passed. He had spent years drifting from place to place, never finding anywhere that felt like home. But Gwen's small cabin, with its worn furniture and patched curtains, felt more like home than anywhere he had ever been. One evening in late September, as they sat on Gwen's porch watching the sunset, she finally voiced what had been growing between them. "You've been so good to us," she said quietly, "better than you had any reason to be." "I care about you," Dawson said simply. "Both of you." Gwen reached over and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched since that desperate night on the trail, and the contact sent electricity through both of them. "I care about you too," Gwen admitted. "More than I expected to care about anyone again." "Your husband has only been gone 6 months," Dawson said carefully. "I don't want to dishonor his memory or rush you into anything." Gwen turned to face him fully. "James was a good man and I loved him, but he's gone and I'm still here. I have a son to raise, a life to live, and I want to live it with someone who makes me feel the way you do." "How do I make you feel?" Dawson asked, his voice low. "Safe," Gwen said. "Hopeful, like maybe the future is not something to fear but something to look forward to." Dawson leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Gwen met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise rather than passion. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "I want to do this right," Dawson said. "I want to court you properly, give you time to be sure." "I'm already sure," Gwen replied, "but I appreciate that you want to be respectful." So Dawson courted her. He brought her flowers from the meadows outside town. He took her on picnics when baby Dawson was old enough to travel, spreading blankets under the pine trees and talking for hours. He taught her to fish in the nearby creeks and made her laugh when he fell in trying to grab a wriggling trout. He held her baby son and sang off key cowboy songs that somehow always got the infant to sleep. The people of Seattle watched the romance bloom with approval. Gwen had been well-liked even before her tragedy, and everyone was glad to see her finding happiness again. Dawson, initially an outsider, was quickly accepted once people saw how devoted he was to Gwen and her son. The owner of the local livery stable offered him steady work managing horses, work that paid well and kept him close to town. By December, when the first snows dusted the hills around Seattle, Dawson knew it was time. He saved up money from his work at the livery and bought a simple gold band from the town jeweler. On Christmas Eve, with baby Dawson sleeping peacefully in his cradle and a fire crackling in the hearth, Dawson got down on one knee. "Gwen Nelson," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I came to Washington Territory looking for work, but I found something much more valuable. I found you. I found a family. I found a home. Will you marry me?" Gwen did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, pulling him up into a kiss. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church at the center of Seattle. Gwen wore a simple blue dress, her best one, with flowers in her hair. Dawson wore his only suit, brushed and cleaned until it looked almost new. Baby Dawson, now 4 months old, was held by Gwen's sister throughout the ceremony. The church was packed with well-wishers, people who had come to care about the young couple and their unusual love story. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Dawson kissed Gwen like he had been waiting his whole life to do it, and in many ways he had been. Their wedding night was gentle and unhurried. Gwen was still nervous, having only been with one man before. But Dawson was patient, taking his time to learn what made her sigh with pleasure. They came together slowly, building heat until they were both gasping, and afterward, Dawson held her close and whispered how much he loved her. "I never thought I could feel this way again," Gwen confessed in the darkness. "After James died, I thought that part of my life was over." "You deserve every happiness," Dawson told her, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." The winter passed peacefully. Dawson moved into Gwen's cabin, which became their home. He added on to it, building an extra room so baby Dawson could have his own space as he grew. He worked hard at the livery stable and took on extra jobs when he could, determined to provide for his new family. Gwen sewed and took in laundry to contribute, though Dawson insisted she did not need to work so hard. "I want to help," Gwen told him firmly. "We're partners in this, remember?" Dawson could not argue with that. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing the work and the joys equally. When baby Dawson took his first steps in March, both parents were there to cheer him on. When he spoke his first word, "Dada," Dawson cried, though he tried to hide it. "He's calling for you," Gwen said softly, watching her husband's reaction with love in her eyes. "I'm his father in every way that matters," Dawson replied. "I may not have been there for his conception, but I was there for his birth. I delivered him into this world, and I'll protect him every day he's in it." As spring bloomed across Washington territory, Gwen realized she was pregnant again. She told Dawson one evening after they had put little Dawson to bed. He stared at her for a long moment, then swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. "Another baby," Dawson marveled. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Gwen asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Dawson said, kissing her soundly. This pregnancy was different from the first. Gwen was not alone this time. She had Dawson beside her every step of the way, rubbing her feet when they swelled, bringing her favorite foods when morning sickness made everything else unbearable. He talked to her growing belly, telling stories to the baby within about the horses he worked with and the life they would have together. In November 1884, just over a year after that fateful day on the trail, Gwen went into labor. This time, they were safely at home with the town doctor in attendance. But when complications arose and the doctor looked worried, it was Dawson who stayed calm. He held Gwen's hand and coached her through it, drawing on the experience of that desperate night when he had delivered little Dawson. "You can do this," he told her firmly. "You're the strongest woman I know. Push, sweetheart, push." And she did. Their daughter entered the world squalling and pink, perfectly healthy. Dawson cut the cord himself, something the doctor allowed given his unique experience. When he placed the baby in Gwen's arms, there were tears streaming down his face. "She's perfect," Gwen whispered. "What should we name her?" "Hope," Dawson said immediately. "Because that's what you gave me. Hope for a better life, hope for a real family, hope for everything I never knew I wanted." Little Hope Anderson became the light of their lives, a beautiful baby girl with her mother's features and her father's steady temperament. Little Dawson, now walking and talking in short sentences, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, telling her stories in his babbling toddler language. The years that followed were full and happy. Dawson took over management of the entire livery stable when the owner retired, a position that came with a good salary and respect in the community. Gwen opened a small sewing shop in town, taking custom orders that allowed her to work from home most days. They saved money carefully, planning for their children's futures. Little Dawson grew into a bright, curious boy who loved animals as much as his father did. By age 5, he was helping at the livery stable after school, learning to curry horses and muck stalls without complaint. Hope was more reserved, preferring books to horses, but she had her father wrapped completely around her finger. In the summer of 1887, Gwen discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the baby came right on schedule in March of 1888. Another boy, whom they named Samuel after Dawson's father. Samuel was a happy, easy baby who rarely fussed and seemed content to observe the world with wide, solemn eyes. Their cabin had grown along with their family, expanded twice more until it was a proper house. Dawson built a wide porch where they spent summer evenings, the children playing while he and Gwen rocked in chairs and watched the sunset. It was a life of simple pleasures, hard work, and deep love. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dawson took Gwen on a trip to the place where they had met. They rode out to those same hills, now without the desperation and fear that had marked their first encounter. They stood in the shade of the boulder cluster where little Dawson had been born, and Gwen leaned back against her husband's chest. "You ever think about that night?" she asked. "All the time," Dawson admitted. "It was the night that changed my entire life. The night I met you, the night I became a father, the night I stopped drifting and finally found where I belonged." "I was so scared," Gwen said softly. "I thought we were both going to die out here." "But you didn't," Dawson said, wrapping his arms around her. "You fought, and you survived, and you brought our son into this world. You're the bravest person I've ever known." "I'm only brave because you make me brave," Gwen replied, turning in his arms to face him. "You gave me a reason to keep fighting that night and every day since." They kissed there in the shade, a kiss full of love and gratitude and promise. When they pulled apart, Gwen smiled up at her husband. "Let's go home," she said. "Home," Dawson agreed, liking the sound of it. "Let's go home." They returned to Seattle as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their children rushed to greet them, little Dawson now 8 years old and responsible enough to have watched his younger siblings with help from Gwen's sister. Hope, 4 years old, launched herself at Gwen with squeals of delight. Baby Samuel, just 1 year old, held out his chubby arms for Dawson to pick him up. That evening, after the children were all tucked into bed, Dawson and Gwen sat on their porch and watched the stars come out. Dawson held his wife close, marveling at how much his life had changed in just 5 years. He had gone from a lonely drifter to a man with a wife he adored, 3 healthy children, and a place to call home. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible. "What are you thinking about?" Gwen asked, sensing his reflective mood. "Just how lucky I am," Dawson said honestly. "That I happened to be tracking that elk that day, that I happened to come around that bend in the trail at exactly the right moment. 5 minutes later and I might have missed you entirely." "I don't think it was luck," Gwen said thoughtfully. "I think it was meant to be. You were meant to find me, meant to save us, meant to become part of our lives." "You believe in fate?" Dawson asked with a slight smile. "I believe in us," Gwen replied. "I believe that some people are meant to find each other, no matter what stands in their way. You and I, we were meant to be together. I'm as certain of that as I am of anything in this world." Dawson kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you, Gwen Anderson, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Gwen said, snuggling closer. "Thank you for saving me that day. Thank you for staying. Thank you for giving me this beautiful life." As the years continued to pass, the Anderson family became a fixture in Seattle. Dawson expanded his business to include buying and selling horses, developing a reputation across Washington territory for his fair dealing and expert eye for quality animals. Gwen's sewing shop flourished, and she trained several young women in the craft, giving them a way to support themselves. Little Dawson, as he grew older, showed a natural talent for working with horses like his father. By age 12, he was helping train young horses, patient and gentle in a way that reminded Dawson of himself at that age. Hope discovered a love of teaching and spent hours tutoring younger children in reading and arithmetic. Samuel, the baby, turned out to have his mother's artistic eye and could often be found sketching horses and landscapes. In 1893, when little Dawson turned 10, the family took a trip to Montana to visit the ranch where Dawson had grown up. It had been sold years earlier, but the new owners were kind enough to let them visit. Dawson showed his children where he had learned to ride, where he had spent countless hours working cattle. Gwen watched him with tears in her eyes, understanding how much it meant to him to share this part of his past with their children. "This is where I became who I am," Dawson told his children as they stood in the barn where he had once slept as a young ranch hand. "This is where I learned everything I know about horses and hard work and what it means to be a man. But all of it, every single thing I learned and experienced, was leading me to your mother, leading me to you." Little Dawson, mature for his 10 years, looked at his father seriously. "Mama told us the story of how you met, how you delivered me when she was all alone on the trail." "I did," Dawson confirmed. "That's why I have your name, right?" the boy asked. "Because you saved my life before I even took my first breath." "You have my name because you're my son," Dawson said firmly, pulling the boy into a hug. "In every way that matters, you're my son. I was there for your first breath and I'll be there for you every day after. Never doubt that." Little Dawson hugged his father back fiercely. At 10 years old, he understood that his father was not his biological parent, but it did not matter. Dawson Anderson was his father in every way that counted, and the bond between them was unbreakable. The trip to Montana strengthened their family bonds even more. On the long journey back to Seattle, they sang songs and told stories, making memories that would last a lifetime. Gwen watched her husband with their children and felt her heart swell with love. This man, who had literally saved her life, had gone on to give her a life worth living. He was an amazing father, a devoted husband, and her best friend in the world. As they approached Seattle, Gwen felt a familiar flutter in her abdomen. She was pregnant again, though she had not yet told Dawson. She smiled to herself, planning how to share the news. That night, after the children were asleep and they were alone in their bedroom, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Again?" Dawson asked, his eyes lighting up with joy. "Again," Gwen confirmed with a laugh. "Apparently we're going to have a big family." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Dawson said, pulling her into a passionate kiss. Their fourth child, a girl they named Grace, was born in early 1894. She had Dawson's dark hair and Gwen's quick smile, and from the moment she arrived, she brought nothing but joy to their household. With 4 children now ranging from baby Grace to 11-year-old Dawson, their house was always full of noise and laughter and love. The financial panic of 1893 affected Seattle less than other places, but there were still hard times. Dawson's horse business slowed as people had less money to spend. Gwen's sewing shop stayed busy with repair work, but custom orders dried up. They had to tighten their belts and watch their spending carefully. But they did it together, as they did everything, and they made sure their children never went hungry or felt insecure. During those lean months, Dawson often thought back to his days as a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name but his horse and saddle. He had lived rough, never knowing where his next meal would come from or where he would sleep. Compared to those days, even the hardest times with Gwen and their children felt like luxury. He had a roof over his head, a warm bed, and a family who loved him. Everything else was just details. By 1896, the economy had recovered and the Anderson family was thriving once more. Dawson had expanded his business to include a stage line between Seattle and the smaller settlements to the east, a venture that proved quite profitable. Gwen had published a book of sewing patterns that sold well throughout the territory. Young Dawson, now 13, was earning money of his own working alongside his father. Hope, at 9 years old, was already helping teach at the local school. Samuel, at 8, sold his sketches to tourists who came through Seattle. And little Grace, at 2, was the darling of everyone who met her. On a warm evening in August 1896, exactly 13 years after that fateful day when Dawson had found Gwen on the trail, the family gathered for a special dinner. Gwen had cooked all of Dawson's favorite foods, and the children had made decorations from wildflowers. When everyone was seated, Gwen raised her glass. 13 years ago today, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I was alone and terrified, certain I was about to die. But then a cowboy came tracking an elk through the hills, and he saved my life. He delivered my baby when no one else was there to help. He kept us both alive through that long night, and then he stayed. He stayed, and he gave me a life more beautiful than I ever imagined possible. Dawson reached for her hand, his own eyes suspiciously bright. This man, Gwen continued, looking at each of their children in turn, is the best father you could ever ask for. He works harder than any 3 men I know. He provides for us, protects us, and loves us with everything he has. I want you all to remember this day and what it represents. It represents hope in the darkest moments. It represents the power of one person to change everything. It represents love that endures through every challenge. To Daddy, little Dawson said, raising his own glass. To Daddy, the other children echoed. Dawson stood, too moved to remain seated. I want to say something too, he said, his voice rough. Before I met your mother, I was nobody. I drifted from place to place, never belonging anywhere. I was good at surviving, but I had never really lived. Then I found your mother and your brother on that trail, and everything changed. I became someone's father, someone's husband, someone who mattered. You all gave me purpose, gave me meaning. I'm the one who should be thanking you. He looked at Gwen, all the love in his heart shining in his eyes. Thank you for trusting me that day. Thank you for letting me into your life. Thank you for loving me and building this incredible family with me. You are my everything, Gwen Anderson. You always will be. There was not a dry eye at the table. Even young Dawson, who at 13 was trying hard to be tough and grown up, was wiping at his face. They ate their dinner with joy and laughter, sharing favorite memories and stories. Later, after the children were in bed, Dawson and Gwen sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. You remember what you said to me that night? Gwen asked quietly. When you first found me. I said a lot of things, Dawson replied with a slight smile. You said you weren't going to let anything happen to me or my baby, Gwen recalled. You promised me we would both survive. I believed you, even though I had no reason to. Even though we were strangers and the situation was impossible. I meant it, Dawson said simply. I looked at you and I knew I would do whatever it took to save you. Why? Gwen asked. Why did you care so much about a stranger? Dawson thought about it for a long moment. I think I fell in love with you the moment I saw you, he admitted. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. Even in that terrible moment, terrified and in pain, you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And so brave, so incredibly brave. I knew I would move heaven and earth to save you. I fell in love with you that night too, Gwen confessed. When you promised me we would both survive, I saw the man you were, strong and capable and kind. I knew if we made it through, I never wanted to let you go. They kissed under the stars, a kiss that held 13 years of love and partnership and shared joy. When they finally pulled apart, they simply held each other, content in the silence. The years continued to flow like water, bringing both challenges and triumphs. In 1899, little Dawson turned 16 and announced he wanted to start his own horse training business. Rather than being threatened, Dawson was proud. He helped his son set up shop in a barn on the outskirts of Seattle, lending him money for the startup costs and teaching him everything he knew about running a business. Hope, at 12, had become an accomplished pianist and often played at church services and town gatherings. Samuel's artwork had attracted the attention of a gallery owner in the growing city of Tacoma, and he had sold several pieces. Little Grace, at 5, was already showing signs of her mother's skill with needle and thread. Gwen, at 39, was still beautiful in Dawson's eyes, though her hair was starting to show threads of silver. Dawson himself, at 42, had a few more lines around his eyes, and his back sometimes ached from years of hard work. But they were both happy, both fulfilled, both still deeply in love. On their 15th wedding anniversary in January 1900, Dawson surprised Gwen with a trip to Portland, Oregon. They left the children with Gwen's sister and took the train south, spending 3 glorious days exploring the city and enjoying time alone together. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate in restaurants, and wandered through the streets holding hands like young lovers. On their last night in Portland, as they sat in their hotel room overlooking the city, Gwen turned to Dawson with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," she said. Dawson felt a flash of worry. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant again," Gwen said, then laughed at his shocked expression. I know. I'm nearly 40 and we already have 4 children, but life keeps surprising us." Dawson whooped with joy, picking her up and spinning her around just as he had done years earlier. "Another baby," he marveled. "After all these years. Are you happy?" Gwen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Are you kidding?" "I'm thrilled," Dawson said, setting her down gently. "Every child we've had has been a blessing. This one will be too." Their 5th child, another boy they named Thomas, was born in August 1900, 17 years after little Dawson's dramatic entrance into the world. The birth was uneventful, attended by a doctor at their home with Dawson holding Gwen's hand throughout. When it was over and their new son was nursing peacefully, Dawson marveled at how different this experience was from that first desperate night. "We've come a long way," he said softly. "We certainly have," Gwen agreed with a tired smile. The older children adored their baby brother. Young Dawson, now 17 and running his own business, would come home from work and immediately take the baby, walking him around the house and singing the same off-key cowboy songs his father had sung to him. Hope helped with nighttime feedings, and Samuel drew picture after picture of his new brother. Grace, at 6, appointed herself the baby's official protector. As the new century dawned, the Anderson family looked to the future with optimism. Seattle was growing rapidly, transforming from a frontier town into a real city. Dawson's businesses were thriving, and Gwen's reputation as a seamstress and designer had spread throughout the region. Their oldest children were making their own ways in the world, while the younger ones still filled the house with energy and noise. In the spring of 1902, young Dawson announced his engagement to a young woman named Sarah, whom he had met through his horse training business. Dawson and Gwen could not have been more pleased. Sarah was kind, hardworking, and clearly adored their son. The wedding was planned for June, and preparations consumed the household for months. On the day of the wedding, Dawson stood beside his oldest son and felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought back to that tiny, struggling infant he had delivered with his own hands, and now here was that baby, grown into a fine man about to start his own family. When young Dawson said his vows, his voice strong and steady, Dawson felt Gwen grip his hand tightly. They exchanged a look that spoke volumes about pride, love, and the passage of time. At the reception, young Dawson pulled his parents aside. "I need to thank you both," he said seriously, "for everything you've given me, every sacrifice you've made. Dad, I know you're not my biological father, but you're my father in every way that matters. You saved my life before I even took my first breath, and you've been saving it every day since by showing me what it means to be a good man." Dawson pulled his son into a fierce hug. "You never need to thank me for being your father. It's the greatest privilege of my life." They stood there for a long moment, father and son, bonded by love that transcended biology. When they finally pulled apart, all three of them were crying. The years that followed brought more changes. Hope married a schoolteacher in 1905 and moved to Olympia, where she opened her own school. Samuel was accepted to an art school in San Francisco and left in 1906, promising to write every week. Grace, growing into a lovely young woman, took over much of Gwen's sewing business, showing even more talent than her mother. Little Thomas, the surprise baby born when Gwen was nearly 40, grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved books and learning. He reminded Dawson of himself in some ways, always asking questions and trying to understand how things worked. By 1910, Dawson and Gwen were grandparents 3 times over. Young Dawson and Sarah had 2 children, and Hope had 1. The house that had been built for a young widow and her infant son now frequently overflowed with children and grandchildren, filled with laughter and life. On a warm August evening in 1910, 27 years after that fateful day on the trail, Dawson and Gwen returned once more to the place where they had met. They had made this pilgrimage several times over the years, always on the anniversary of little Dawson's birth. But this time felt different, more significant somehow. They stood in the shade of the boulder cluster, now older and grayer but still deeply in love. Dawson put his arm around his wife, and they looked out over the landscape that had witnessed their first meeting. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come along that day?" Dawson asked. "I try not to," Gwen admitted. "It's too terrible to think about, but I know this. You were meant to find me. We were meant to have this life together. Every hardship we've faced, every joy we've celebrated, it was all meant to be. We've built something incredible, haven't we?" Dawson said softly. 5 children, 3 grandchildren so far, 2 successful businesses, a life full of love and meaning. "We have," Gwen agreed. "And it all started right here, with a cowboy who refused to let me die, who delivered my baby with his own hands, and who chose to stay even when he could have ridden away." Dawson turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I want you to know something. Every single day of the last 27 years has been a gift. Every morning I wake up next to you, every evening we spend on our porch, every moment with our children and grandchildren. It's all been more than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me a life worth living, Gwen. You gave me purpose and love and a family. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Gwen's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life that day, but you've been saving it ever since. You've loved me through grief and joy, through poverty and prosperity. You've been my rock, my partner, my best friend. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." They kissed there in the shade, a kiss full of 27 years of memories. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling through their tears. "Let's go home," Gwen said, just as she had all those years ago. "Home, Dawson agreed. "Let's go home to our family." They rode back to Seattle as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Their house, larger now than the small cabin Gwen had lived in as a young widow, was lit up with lamps in every window. As they approached, they could hear laughter and voices. Young Dawson and his family were there, having come for dinner. Grace was playing the piano while Thomas sang along, slightly off-key just like his father. Dawson helped Gwen down from the wagon and they stood for a moment, just looking at their home. It was not fancy or grand, but it was filled with love and life and everything that mattered. "This," Dawson said quietly, gesturing to the house and everything it represented, "this is what I was meant for, not drifting from place to place, but right here, building a life with you." "We built it together," Gwen corrected gently. "Every step of the way together." They walked into their house hand in hand, greeted by the warmth of family and the life they had created together. That night, after everyone had gone home and the younger children were in bed, Dawson and Gwen sat on their porch for what must have been the 1,000th time. "You have any regrets?" Gwen asked suddenly. Dawson thought about it seriously before answering. "Not a single one," he said finally. "Every decision I made led me to you, and every decision we've made together has been the right one. Our life isn't perfect, but it's ours, and I wouldn't change a thing." "Me neither," Gwen said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Even the hard parts were worth it because we faced them together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of Seattle growing and changing, the 20th century bringing new technologies and new ways of life. But here on their porch, some things remained eternal. Love, family, commitment, partnership. As they finally headed to bed, Dawson pulled Gwen close and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" Gwen asked. "For trusting me that day, for letting me save you, for building this beautiful life with me. For loving me even when I was just a drifter with nothing to offer but my 2 hands and my word." "You had everything to offer," Gwen corrected him. "You had a good heart, strong hands, and the courage to do what needed doing. That's all I ever needed." They made love that night with the tenderness that comes from decades of intimacy, knowing each other's bodies and hearts completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Gwen's head on Dawson's chest, his fingers trailing through her silver-streaked hair. "I hope our story helps people believe in miracles," Gwen said softly, "because that's what you were to me, a miracle that came riding out of nowhere exactly when I needed one most." "You were my miracle too," Dawson replied. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a family, a reason to be better than I ever thought I could be." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and real. Their love story, which had begun in desperation and fear, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. More grandchildren arrived, and eventually great-grandchildren. Dawson's hair went completely gray, and Gwen moved a bit more slowly, but their love never dimmed. They remained devoted partners, best friends, and passionate lovers well into their later years. On August 15, 1923, exactly 40 years after that fateful day on the trail, the entire Anderson family gathered for a massive celebration. Young Dawson, now 40 years old with children of his own who were having children, organized the event. All 5 of Dawson and Gwen's children were there, along with their spouses and children. The house overflowed with family, 3 generations strong. As the celebration reached its peak, young Dawson called for everyone's attention. "40 years ago today," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room, My mother was alone on a trail, about to give birth 3 weeks early with no help in sight. She was terrified and certain she was going to die. Then a cowboy tracking an elk came around a bend and found her. That cowboy delivered me with his own hands, kept both of us alive through the night, and then decided to stay. That decision changed everything. He looked at Dawson and Gwen, who were seated in places of honor. These two people built an incredible life together. They raised 5 children, ran successful businesses, and created a legacy of love that extends to all of us here today. They showed us what it means to be devoted partners, loving parents, and good people. Everything good in my life I owe to them. The room erupted in applause. Dawson and Gwen stood, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from their family. They looked around at the faces of their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, seeing their legacy reflected in each one. "I don't have fancy words," Dawson said when the applause died down. "I'm just a cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But I want all of you to know something. Every person in this room is proof that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Gwen and I built this family on a foundation of love, respect, and partnership. We faced every challenge together and celebrated every triumph together. That's the legacy I hope you all carry forward." Gwen added her own words. 40 years ago, I thought my life was over. I was a widow with a baby coming too early, alone on a trail miles from help. But then Dawson found me, and he did not just save my life. He gave me a reason to live. He gave me love and partnership and a family beyond my wildest dreams. Every person here today is part of that miracle. You are all proof that even in our darkest moments, hope can find us. There was not a dry eye in the house. The celebration continued late into the night, filled with music and laughter and stories. Dawson and Gwen sat at the center of it all, holding hands and watching their family with pride and joy. As the evening wound down and family members began to leave, young Dawson approached his parents one more time. At 40 years old, he was a successful businessman with a family of his own, but he would always be the baby that Dawson had delivered in the wilderness. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything." Dawson pulled his oldest son into a hug. "Delivering you was the most terrifying and wonderful thing I ever did. Watching you grow into the man you've become has been my greatest joy." "You set an impossible standard," young Dawson said with a slight smile. "Being the kind of father you are, the kind of husband. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to your example." "You've exceeded it," Dawson said firmly. "You're an incredible man, an amazing father, and I'm so proud of you." As the last guests departed and the house grew quiet, Dawson and Gwen made their way to their bedroom. They moved more slowly now, both in their 60s and feeling the weight of years. But when they climbed into bed and Dawson pulled Gwen close, they felt as connected as they had been at 23 and 26. 40 years, Gwen marveled. 40 years since you saved my life. 40 years since you gave my life meaning, Dawson countered. They lay together in the darkness, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of intimacy. They had been through so much together. The desperate night on the trail, the early days of courtship, the joy of their wedding, 5 pregnancies and births, financial struggles and successes. Watching their children grow and have families of their own. Through it all, they had remained devoted partners, always facing the world together. "You think we'll get another 40 years?" Gwen asked softly. "I hope we get forever," Dawson replied. "But even if we don't, we've lived more fully than most people dream of. We've built something incredible, Gwen. A family, a legacy, a love story that will last long after we're gone." "Tell me again," Gwen said, as she had done countless times over the years. "Tell me about the night we met." So Dawson did. He told her about tracking the elk through the hills, about coming around the bend and seeing the overturned wagon. He told her about following her tracks to the rocks and finding her there, desperate and terrified. He told her about delivering little Dawson, about cutting the cord with his knife, about wrapping the baby in his shirt. He told her about staying through the night, keeping watch while she and the baby slept. "I knew that night that my life had changed forever," Dawson said. "I looked at you holding that baby, and I knew I would never be the same. You became my purpose, my reason for being. Everything I've done since then has been for you and our family." "You became my hero," Gwen said softly. "My savior and my partner and my great love. I thank God every day that you were tracking that elk, that you came around that bend at exactly the right moment. You were the answer to my prayers, Dawson. Then and every day since." They made love one more time, slow and tender, celebrating 40 years of partnership and passion. Afterward they held each other close, Gwen's head tucked under Dawson's chin, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I love you," Gwen whispered as sleep claimed her. "I love you too," Dawson replied. "Always and forever." They slept peacefully, two souls so perfectly matched that they moved as one even in dreams. Outside, the stars shone down on Seattle, on the house they had filled with love and life, on the family they had created together. Somewhere in those hills outside town, in the shade of ancient boulders, the place where they had met stood silent witness to their incredible journey. Dawson and Gwen lived many more years together, eventually celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by an even larger family. They watched their youngest son, Thomas, graduate from university and become a teacher. They attended the weddings of grandchildren and held great-great-grandchildren in their arms. They remained devoted partners until the very end, never spending a single night apart. When Dawson passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 79, Gwen held his hand through his final breath. She mourned him deeply, but took comfort in knowing they had lived a full and beautiful life together. She followed him just 8 months later, her heart unable to beat without its other half. They were buried side by side in the Seattle cemetery, their headstones simple but meaningful. Together forever. Dawson and Gwen Anderson. A love born in desperation, forged in devotion, eternal in memory. Their children made sure the story of how they met was passed down through generations. The tale of the cowboy who delivered a baby in the wilderness and stayed to build a life with the mother became a family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. It became a reminder that love can be found in the most unexpected places, that courage and kindness can change everything, and that the bonds we forge in our most desperate moments can last a lifetime. The Anderson family continued to grow and thrive, spreading across Washington and beyond. But they never forgot their roots, never forgot the story of Dawson and Gwen. Every year on August 15, family members would make a pilgrimage to those rocks outside Seattle, to the place where it all began. They would stand in the shade of the boulders and remember the cowboy who refused to let a mother and baby die, who delivered a child with his own hands, and who stayed to build one of the greatest love stories the family had ever known. The legacy of Dawson and Gwen lived on in every marriage built on partnership and respect, in every act of courage and kindness, in every family bond strengthened by love. They had started with nothing but desperation and hope, and they had built something that would last for generations. Their story proved that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings, that love can bloom even in the harshest circumstances, and that one person's courage can change the course of many lives. Dawson had been tracking an elk that day, but what he found was so much more. He found his purpose, his family, his home. He found the woman who would make him better than he ever dreamed he could be. And Gwen, alone and terrified on that trail, had been saved not just from death but from a life of loneliness and despair. Dawson had given her a second chance at love, at happiness, at building a family. Together, they had created something beautiful out of the worst moment of her life. In the end, their story was proof that love conquers all, that courage and kindness matter, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. A cowboy tracking an elk. A woman giving birth too early and too alone. A desperate night that became the foundation of a lifetime of love. Dawson and Gwen Anderson lived, loved, and left a legacy that would never be forgotten. Their story became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of love, the importance of courage, and the incredible impact one person can have when they choose to stay instead of walking away. They proved that heroes are not always found in grand gestures, but sometimes in the simple choice to help someone in need, to deliver a baby in the wilderness, to keep two people alive when all hope seems lost, and then to build a life together filled with love, devotion, and partnership that lasts forever.